welcome to Governing Pandemics 101.
Hello and welcome back to the fourth session of GP 101, an online course offered by the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies. My name is Gian Luca Burci. I'm an adjunct professor of international law, and these lectures will be devoted to an important topic, that is the possibility and the condition for sharing pathogens internationally for public health purposes. And the topic of my lecture today will be the conditions under which human pathogen can be shared internationally for public health purposes. By human pathogens, I mean viruses, but also bacteria, parasites, fungi, all kinds of microorganisms that can disease to humans. The sharing normally takes place between laboratories, research institutions, universities, centers for disease control in different countries. I focus on human pathogens, but what I will say could be also applied to animal pathogens, for example, even plant pathogens, and so on. So first of all, why is it important to share pathogens for public health purposes? It's kind of self-intuitive, but you need to access the sample of the actual pathogens to identify what it is, to characterize it, to understand its characteristics, and most importantly, to start researching the development of future what we call medical countermeasure, diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccine, and so on. The sample as such, the little tube with liquid, sometimes is not enough. You need to share data, and fundamentally two classes of data. The first is what we call metadata. For example, who is the patient, where it was collected, what are the comorbidities, what is the context around that sample. And second, genetic sequence data. That is the possibility to turn a physical sample into a digital file, to code the genome of the virus and to turn it into a computer file. But I will talk about that at the end of my lecture. So this is historically an under-regulated area from an international law point of view. For a long time, it's been shaped by the practice of the group of scientists that shared pathogens and used it. And so there is a development of self-organization kind of practices and communities of scientists that basically get specialized in a particular pathogen, whether it's malaria, tuberculosis, Zika, HIV/AIDS, and so on. So they develop their own mini laws, as it were. Empirically, we don't have that much knowledge about the practices of sharing, and that's a project that we carried out here at the Global Health Center. Outside of influenza, where we have an historically well-developed network of laboratories, there wasn't much empirical knowledge. And so pathogen sharing becomes a more complicated, more politicized, more fragmented and area of public health and subject to international law claim. And the reason for that, it's the claim, the pushback from many developing countries that the rules for sharing were fundamentally unfair and inequitable. The countries were giving the samples of pathogens for free, but then these would end up in the hands of pharmaceutical companies, develop very expensive vaccines that this country would have to buy at market prices. So it was a challenge to the systemic approach to pathogen sharing. And the historical incident that opened this Pandora box was in 2007, when Indonesia all of a sudden refused to share its samples of human avian influenza, H5N1. That was at the time of the big fear about the pandemic of avian influenza. And so it became like a shock to the public health community and beyond. And so why was this a Pandora box? What did it open? What did it create? Fundamentally, from a legal point of view, which interests me as a lawyer, Indonesia's claim that was espoused by many developing countries was based on environmental law, in particular on the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. I will call it CBD for brevity. That was a treaty adopted in 1992. It is basically universal. The only major country outside of it is the United States. And it was a convention as a reaction to the loss of biodiversity, to conserve biodiversity, but also against biopiracy, against companies from rich countries poaching resources from developing countries. So there was a clear political intent to give leverage to developing countries and to redress the power differentials. Health was not in the mind of the drafter, that's for sure. But Indonesia claimed that pathogen fell under the scope of the convention because of the definitions about genetic material, a bit cryptic, but Indonesia said clear enough, And why was it important to make that claim? Because the CBD is based on three principles: the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use, meaning the access, but also the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. And these three principles are on an equal footing. They have to come together as a package, as a bargain. And what are the conditions for accessing genetic material, genetic resources? Fundamentally three. The first is sovereign right over biological resources. The state has sovereignty over the resources under its jurisdiction, and so it's up to the states to determine the condition for access. The second, and that's the term of art in environmental law, is prior informed consent. The state has to authorize the export of a genetic material. And the third is mutually agreed terms. It's literally a bargaining, a transactional approach where the releasing state gets some benefit in return. So for a while there was a pushback. Should pathogens be included in the CBD? After all, the CBD is about conserving biodiversity. But here we have pathogens that kill humans that we would like, if possible, to eradicate. And also pathogens move across boundaries. Does it make sense to claim jurisdiction just because you happen to found it on a particular day of the week? But in the end, this claim was successful, and there is an increasing consensus that pathogens do fall under the regime on biodiversity. So as I just said, the CBD has a very bilateral transactional approach. And an open question, and the central question for our purposes, is this appropriate for public health purposes? In particular, at times of emergency, look back to COVID, to Ebola. Intuitively, there's not the time to spend weeks negotiating terms of access. So there is a clear push by the public health community in favor of a multilateral system with clear, pre-agreed, global and predictable rules for sharing human pathogens. So the question is how to fit it in the biodiversity regimes. The CBD is what we call a framework convention. That's a term of art for many environmental treaties. Basically, that the convention has like general principle, general provisions, but then sets up an institutional machinery, conference of the parties, committees, and so on, to develop this normative framework, to develop along science, to develop in many senses. And one of the ways to develop the normative framework is through protocols. Protocols are separate treaties, but they are linked to the mother convention because they spell out some of its provisions. And normally you can become a party to the protocol only if you are a party to the main convention. So the CBD is no exception, and it has two protocols. One is a Cartagena protocol on biosafety. The second, that concerns us, is the so-called Nagoya protocol that was adopted in 2010. It has 137 parties and spells out the provision on equitable and fair sharing of benefits contained in the CBD. So they put more flesh on the bones. They're more prescriptive. They require the appointment of national authorities. They even have a list of possible benefits and so on. Finally, the CBD and Nagoya are what lawyers call incomplete contracts. That is to say, they are still fairly generic and they need a fair amount of national implementation. They need laws. They need states to implement them in their own legal system. And that is another problem in a way, because there has been a very uneven trend to implementation. Certain countries don't even have a national law on this. Other countries have and mention pathogens. Some laws don't mention pathogens. The national approaches are different. So we have a patchwork of national legislation that sometimes don't talk to each other and carry the risk of slowing down and making more difficult sharing of pathogens. So we have several examples of that, including in an area as sensitive as seasonal influenza. At the same time, the Nagoya Protocol takes health into account. It was not oblivious to health, in particular in two ways. The first, it has an article, Article 8, that asks its parties to take into account the need for health response, for example, during emergency in the legislation. And in the second, at a multilateral level, because it has an article, Article 4, that allows parties to adopt what they call specialized international instruments. that is like its own mini treaties that should be compatible with the principles of fairness and equity of the CBD and Nagoya, but that sometimes be carved out for particular genetic material and resources. So this is the law in extreme brevity. What is the response from the public health community? And what are some of the open questions? And I want to underline there are many open questions. This is a work in progress. It's a very open field. I'm afraid in the next 5 minutes I won't be able to give you big conclusions and big solutions because it's still very much discussed in WHO and elsewhere. So I would mention 3 in particular. The first is that WHO reacted to the Indonesia crisis by negotiating in 4 years, a very difficult negotiation, an instrument called PIP framework. PIP stands for Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. That is a non-binding framework, it's not a treaty, and wants to ring-fence, if you want, the system of cooperation around the sharing of pandemic influenza viruses. So it formalizes the network of laboratories that have been cooperating since the 1950s. It sets the condition for sharing the virus within this network, but most importantly outside, for example to pharmaceutical companies, and creates a multilateral framework for sharing of benefits. So avoiding the splintering of the system in so many bilateral negotiations, the benefits flow through WHO according to public health needs. In my view, it's a good instrument, and it turned out to be like a model and a reference for the current debate. The second question is more existential and goes back to what I was saying before. Is Nagoya adequate for public health, for the needs, in particular at times of emergency? Some people say yes, because we don't want to lose the leverage given to developing countries in the name of public health. It can be accommodated. But there is, I think, an increasing consensus that public health needs a dedicated framework. And that is becoming part of the conversation about the pandemic instruments that just started in WHO, whether it's a treaty or otherwise, we'll see. That the condition for sharing human pathogens has to be regulated there in a way that responds to public health needs. The devil is in the detail, and it will be difficult to agree, I think, on all the aspects to which pathogen should be applied, since we don't know what's coming down the road. Who decides? What are the implications of putting a pathogen under a dedicated system? What are the economic implications? Will it prevent, for example, patented genetic sequences and so on? There are many open questions that are well summarized in the reading by Dario Piselli that we assigned to you for this class. If we go in this direction, everybody agrees that it has to be fit within the conditions of the Nagoya Protocol. Avoid clashes between different legal instruments that would make the life of states otherwise very difficult. The final point, and very, very important, is the status of genetic sequence data. So once again, the possibility to turn a sample of a pathogen into a computer file. This was not an issue in the early 90s. This technology was basically undeveloped. And it's become much more widespread, much more available, even to developing countries. And it can be used to, in part, replace the sharing of samples. You can do things with genetic sequence files that you can also do with samples. And what is the problem? The problem is that neither the Biodiversity Convention, nor the Nagoya Protocol, nor the PIP framework mention GSD as such. They are based on the idea of sharing material samples. And so there is a fairly painful and slow process within the governance of the Biodiversity Convention whether the concept of GSD can be fit under the scope of the biodiversity, subject to the same conditions. It's slow, it's painful, and COVID made it even slower. So again, it's a work in progress. But there is no agreement on this. That can lead to some big consequences. The first is that there will be no clear international legal framework regulating GSD. So it will be left very much to transactional, transnational approaches that are not necessarily part of international law. And so these can create different solutions for different pathogens that can lead to a privatization, if you want, of genetic sequence data. Right now, there's a number of databases or platforms in which these genetic sequences are shared. One of the most popular is so-called GSAID, based in Germany, and that was the repository of choice for COVID-19. Hundreds of thousands of sequences are deposited there. But these are individual initiatives, sometimes with different conditions for approach. I also leave open the very vexed question about the possibility of patenting some of the genetic sequences. It happened for MERS, for example. And there are different solutions in different jurisdictions. Probably it will not be possible in the United States, but it may be possible in Western Europe. So with the risk of very diverse regimes for something which can become more and more important for public health. So again, there are conversations going on in WHO, in the governance of the CBD. They'll definitely become part of the negotiation over the future instruments. And that's more or less where we are. I'm afraid I cannot give you just the big truth and the big conclusion, but it gives you a set of the questions that are being discussed around this very important topic.